here. But I think it's 3, so I think we can get started. So hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Hanna Homestead. I'm the Climate and Militarism Program Director at the Center for International Policy. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today. I want to first just start this panel by acknowledging the incredible difficulty of this current moment. We are currently witnessing the firsthand horrors of Israel's genocidal violence against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and the occupied Palestinian territory. The images and the suffering that are coming out of Gaza are beyond horrific and what should ever be considered to be believable. So it's a deeply painful time and very terrifying time, especially for those with ties to the region. So we want to be cognizant of that, and also are especially grateful for our panelists today who are so graciously sharing their time and expertise with us, and of course to everybody here for showing up. So I just want to share some opening remarks before introducing our amazing speakers and before beginning our discussion, and time permitting, getting to the Q&A, which is active. So please do, if you're here, submit questions through there. So the topic of today's panel is the severe, widespread environmental impacts of explosive weapons and their long-term implications on civilian health, human rights, and global security. As we're seeing in Gaza, explosive weapons are actively causing unfathomable human suffering, destruction of critical infrastructure, and mass death, with the death toll in Gaza approaching around 40,000 people, and of course, many more likely under the rubble. Bombings and shelling, especially in highly populated areas like the Gaza Strip, and especially at the indiscriminate and excessive scale we're seeing, also inevitably lead to environmental destruction and contamination that remain long after the bombs explode. Weapons like the bombs dropped on refugee tents in Rafah or the 120mm tank shells that were found near the body of 6-year-old Hinrajab are themselves a major source of toxic contamination, as they contain chemicals and heavy metals which pollute the soil, air, and water. The effects of contamination extend far beyond the direct loss of life, causing long-lasting environmental harm, including toxicity, birth defects, cancers, economic and ecological precarity that unmitigated can persist for generations. The long-term and widespread impacts of these weapons, as well as the infrastructure and industries that enable their production, transportation, and use, are often overlooked when we talk about armed conflict. There are no requirements to remediate environmental destruction post-conflict, and the worst effects are often usually borne by those most vulnerable and least responsible for their creation. The environment is typically considered just a casualty of war. This is not only a moral failure, but a strategic one if our goal is truly long-term peace and security for everyone in the region, and also to have a livable planet. It's well established that ecosystems, human health, and political stability are inextricably linked. The relationship between violence, environmental degradation, poverty, and displacement has been extensively documented. This intersection is why we wanted to hold this panel today on World Environment Day, a day dedicated to encouraging worldwide awareness and action to protect our environment. We want to draw connections between how weapons are fueling unfathomable human suffering and violence, but also furthering cycles of conflict and militarization that can only deliver further violence and destruction and hasten us towards planetary collapse. However, just as we cannot overlook the direct impact of these weapons in isolation, it is impossible to talk about the violence happening in Gaza today without a broader conversation of U.S. foreign policy and militarization and colonialism in the region. The U.S. government has not just been complicit, it's been an active partner in the ongoing genocide. Over the last 8 months, the Israeli government's efforts to make Gaza uninhabitable have been carried out with full U.S. political and military support. In addition to the nearly $4 billion in financing provided annually to Israel to buy U.S.-made weapons, the ongoing delivery of U.S. origin arms to Israel has continued with bipartisan congressional support, despite Israel's intensifying military operations in Gaza that are in clear violation of the International Court of Justice rulings, U.S. laws and policies, and the international laws of war. It is important to acknowledge that ongoing U.S. support is not due to a specific political party, lobby, super PAC, or industry, but a convergence of economic, ideological, and strategic interests that empower supremacist ideologies and financial gains over human rights, ecological security, and justice. The establishment of World Environment Day itself gives us some insight into this process of how we've arrived at this genocide today. and the climate crisis we're also facing globally. World Environment Day was established by the United Nations in 1972 at the Stockholm Conference. Galvanized by widespread ecological destruction that the US caused during the war in Vietnam, the world had convened to focus on the human interactions on the environment and how to better protect it. The conference produced the Stockholm Declaration, which created the United Nations Environmental Program and laid the foundation for future global governance. But notably, the United States did not sign on to the Stockholm Declaration in 1972. In fact, it joined a group of Western nations that had attempted to stifle the rules for protecting the environment and tried to inhibit rules that would inhibit global pollution controls. As enhanced environmental protections would prevent or inconvenience US pursuit of atomic weapons and US industry interests in exploiting global fossil fuel resources that are believed necessary for economic and military domination and therefore our national security. So by the time in 1972 that this was happening, the US had already identified the Middle East as a region of strategic interest due to its large oil reserves and had already spent decades militarizing the region in great power competition with the Soviet Union over power and access to oil. There had been ongoing weapons for oil deals with Saudi Arabia. The US had deposed Iran's democratically elected leader who had attempted to nationalize Iranian oil. And this allowed the US and European countries to continue exploiting oil reserves to the detriment of Iranian society and our climate. Let us remember also at this time, US companies and the US government had known for decades that continuing to burn fossil fuels will cause global warming that inevitably leads to climate change. Yet this did not stop them from choosing to militarize and continue to invest in fossil fuel dominance. And since this time, the US has continued to invest billions into Israel, which is seen as a strategic partner in regards to these regional energy interests. As President Biden has said many times, if there were not an Israel, we would have to create an Israel to protect our interests in the region. As part of this partnership, the US has consistently put our national interests in global military and economic dominance over policies that would enhance climate resilience and justice. And that includes overlooking Israel's crimes against Palestinians, continual illegal land seizures, the establishment of apartheid state, and the ongoing Nakba, which has continued since 1948. So this is why when we talk about Palestine, it's often called the tip of the spear of imperialism, as it's the site of where powerful interests are converging to fuel colonialization, continued militarization, and consequently, but unsurprisingly, continued arms resistance. The resulting instability and violence is then used to justify further militarization, which only furthers these same cycles of violence, ecological destruction, and instability. So this brings us to the present moment where we're seeing the worst kind of violence unfold in Gaza. The weapons the United States is providing to Israel to commit this genocide is doing nothing to solve the root problems of injustice. It's only exacerbating conditions that are antithetical to peace. So it's important to recognize these mutually reinforcing relationships between war, degradation, and instability, between injustice and resistance, between militarization and climate crisis. And this is not just an intellectual exercise we're doing. It's critical to really crafting effective strategies and interventions to interrupt these cycles. We need an immediate ceasefire now, but not only that, we need to uproot and rectify the ideological and material structures that are enabling this genocide to take place in the first place. So we hope this conversation today can help explain more on why the environmental impacts of war and weapons must be considered and accounted for in the costs of war. We hope we will bring some clarity to how oppressive systems impact us all in interconnected ways. And we hope to inspire action that supports action towards collective liberation and collective security. And so with that introduction, I'm really, really honored to introduce our amazing panel today to talk through these points in more detail. Joining us, we have Rasha Abousalem, who's a Palestinian-American humanitarian aid worker, Red Cross presenter, and an adjunct professor. As the child of Palestinian refugees, she's dedicated her life to advocating not only for Palestinian rights, but for humanity worldwide, and has traveled to over 40 refugee camps around the world, throughout Europe, the Middle East, and South Asia. And Rasha is joining us today from Egypt, where she's going to help give an on-the-ground update about the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza. We're so thankful to have you, Rasha. We also have Dr. Meena Aladdin, who is joining us. Meena is an Iraqi-American scientist who arrived in the United States with her family in 1991. She earned her PhD in molecular toxicology from Johns Hopkins University and is currently pursuing a master's degree from Harvard School of Public Health. And Meena is here, and she's going to help us understand the long-term and widespread toxic effects of these weapons and war pollution in greater detail. And then we have Dr. Mazin Qumsiyeh, who is a renowned and award-winning Palestinian scientist and author. Mazin has earned his PhD in zoology and genetics, and he's published over 160 scientific papers, over 30 book chapters, and several books on topics ranging from the cultural heritage in Palestine to human rights to biodiversity and conservation and cancer and the effects of siege and imperialism. He's currently leading efforts to produce the new National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan for Palestine. He's also the founder of the Palestine Institute for Biodiversity and Sustainability at Bethlehem University. Dr. Qumsiyeh will help us understand the effects of these weapons in the context of ongoing siege, as well as why climate and environmental justice is so critical to lasting peace and security. So thank you all so much for being here. We're just honored to have you all. And without further ado, I'd love to turn to Rasha to give us an update from Egypt.
Yes, hello. Can you all hear me? Because my connection is iffy.
I can hear you.
Okay. Because my video is freezing and my audio is freezing. So I'm just gonna, if something happens, just someone message me in the chat and I'll be able to see it. But hello, everyone. Thank you so much. I really hope my connection holds out. We're having a heat wave here and everything's going a little crazy. So my name is Rasha Abousalem. Thank you, Hanna, so much for the introduction. And hello to my fellow panelists and everyone viewing. Yes, so real quick, I'm going to update everyone. I am, like Hanna said, a humanitarian aid worker. I've been doing field work for 10 years. Currently, I am in Cairo, Egypt. I came several days ago, and I'll be here for a total of about 2 weeks for now until I return later on this summer. I came in December into January. We had sent out the first load of 8 trucks then, and since then, I've been able to send out 5 trucks total. Right now, our load, the primary aid that's being concentrated right now is tents. So a lot of organizations are now sending the canvas tents because of the amount of displaced people, especially since the invasion of Rafah had gone underway. At one point, we were sending medical boxes that had anesthesia, little vials of anesthesia, very basic, very, very basic. I want everyone to understand this. They had antibiotics, basic pain meds. So we were able to send out those with gauzes and everything and some needles. Anything that's sent through the checkpoints, everyone needs to understand that they are on an approved list from the Israeli government. We cannot just send what we want. They actually have to be approved. We were also able to send oxygen tank concentrators, several hospital beds last time. What's happened now, though, because pretty much the medical system is not functioning in Gaza anymore, it's very little, I decided to shift the concentration of aid to food boxes because, as we can see, Gaza's turned into a concentration camp and there's forced starvation and forced dehydration. So food has been one of the top priorities. And like I always say, within the priorities, there's priorities. And unfortunately, we have to make tough decisions, especially when we are so limited with the access that we have. So, and then with that, we are also sending canvas tents along with numerous other organizations. Really, the borders, as many of you know, they open, close, open, close. There's usually delayed closings rather than delayed openings. Sometimes they give us a 24-hour notice to pack up, which we have told them numerous times that is not enough. So sometimes we've received 2-3 days, maybe a week if you're lucky, of notice. And different organizations are told when they're allowed to send the trucks to the border. So again, it's not just a free-for-all where everyone can just send trucks, and we obviously have to abide by the national laws here in Egypt. And then, of course, they have to cross, once at Rafah, they have to cross several checkpoints to get to the warehouses in Gaza, because the entire area inside Rafah is militarized. So you have several checkpoints for the Egyptian government, and then you have a couple for the Israeli military. So again, this idea that once the aid, gets to Rafah and then goes in, that's unfortunately not how it works. So the aid can be delayed for days at times as it's being inspected, or just for the border closes for some unforeseen reason. So again, we tend to send things, especially in the food boxes, that obviously have a long shelf life, medication that has a long shelf life, nothing that needs to be refrigerated. So this is why when we're talking about people with specific medical needs, such as people who are insulin reliant, we cannot send that because it needs to be refrigerated. So again, there's a lot of obstacles when it comes to the aid, just sending it. Now, of course, there's the challenges of distributing the aid inside. I just actually received word yesterday. I did not know this. They thought they updated me. They didn't. And I was very sad to hear that on our last convoy, the aid group that does the distribution for us inside Gaza, one of the workers was killed on his way to get our aid. And that completely just broke my heart to hear. So the reality is it is incredibly dangerous. Humanitarians, medical staff, anyone there to do work to serve the population, internationally is a protected group of people, but as we can see, and we've seen repeatedly, when it comes to IHL and rules of war or the laws of war, there has been a lot of disregard for that these past several months, and really the past several years, but especially since October when it comes to the Israeli government. So just real quick before because again, I do IHL also, so I feel obligated. A lot of people, we've had these discussions, what kind of discussions surround when it comes to environmental conversations, when it comes to IHL or international conversations. So really, environmental protection really became more popular, if you will, after the 1970s. And, we know environmental damage in wartime is really inevitable. This is an unfortunate reality. I don't think it's really beneficial for us to sugarcoat it or to talk about it any other way. But there are numerous protocols and conventions that have taken place that would surprise people, that definitely taps into the idea of not just environmental protection for the sake of the civilian population, but a general broader protection of the environment. And they're definitely tied hand in hand, because for you to have a healthy, safe population, you have to have a healthy, safe environment, and you cannot do one without the other. So I think this is something that needs to be acknowledged. So you have, of course, Article 55 of Protocol 1 to the 1949 Geneva Convention, which requires that combatants protect the natural environment against widespread long-term severe damage. You have Article 35, Paragraph 3 of the same convention, which refers to the methods and means of warfare. You also have the Article 1 of the Convention of 1977 on the prohibition of military or any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques. These are very long titles. I did not make them up, folks. You have Principle 21 of Stockholm Declaration of 1972. You have Principle 2 of the Rio Declaration of 1992. You have General Assembly Resolution 4737, which talks about the protection of the environment in times of armed conflict. So again, there are numerous, you have the Convention on the Prohibition of Military or any other, again, hostile use of environmental modification techniques, ENMOD. So you definitely have a lot of conversation happening around problems. It's incredibly broad, and that could also unfortunately be a con to some degree. So this is where I'll end, because I think I took up too much time. And yes, I'll leave it for the questions. Thank you.
No, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for the work you're doing there, the incredible work you're doing there. And I think I'm glad you mentioned the Articles of the Geneva Convention, which my understanding is the United States does not recognize those articles as customary law or or feel bound to them in terms of having to take measures to protect the environment under those cases. So thank you so much for bringing those up. We've just heard a bit from Egypt, and so now I'd love to turn to Meena. We heard from Rasha that we can't have a healthy population without a healthy environment, and we know these weapons that are made with heavy metals and toxic substances that can create long-term pollution of the air, soil, and water. And so with your scientific experience, can you share some information with us about the widespread and long-term effects of these weapons?
Thank you so much for having me today and organizing this, Hanna. So I think what I see with Gaza is, we certainly see the humanitarian crisis that is very, very palpable and visible right now. But I genuinely worry about the long-term effects, and it's because it's not unless in hindsight, most of these studies that were done in the context of war, very few people have actual data during of air pollution and of health problems during active war. A lot of it we collect retrospectively, and you lose so much, and so much of it becomes speculative. Now, the profound effects of this war have only so far as much been estimates at best. And this is in large part because we don't have any more universities in Gaza that are left standing. And so you have the scholasticide on top of an ecocide. And so you really can't study what the heck is happening. What we do know is that there is a lot of pulverization of buildings. And this was only 2 months into the war, and there was some element of sort of estimations 2 months into the war. Now we're almost 8 months in, and the damages are far exceeding our expectations. But I can tell you, so Benjamin Neymark, he had done this sort of conservative estimate of 6 weeks, 60 days into the war, and had estimated that the projected emissions from the Israel-Gaza from this genocide were greater than the annual emissions of 20 individual countries. Now, this is 2 months in, and this also doesn't encapsulate. This was actually rather a very conservative estimate. Now we can set that aside. What I'm genuinely concerned is the long-term projections of cancer and pulmonary diseases. These typically have a fairly long lag time. For cancer, it's 20 to 40 years. Now, that could be accelerated by repeat exposures. And certainly with pulmonary diseases, it's also very similar. The thing that we can maybe gather some historical evidence on is 9/11, which is a single event. It was horrible. And just from that single event, we saw this ensuing effects of over decades long. And so what we saw, and immediately in the aftermath of 9/11 was these increased exposures to a number of not just heavy metals, but you also have asbestos from the buildings, you have building materials, you have pulverized just not just building materials, but also all sorts of glass, steel, and all these other things. And people are being exposed to this. So these are, in law enforcement and the cleanup people who are responsible for cleanup were being exposed to this at a chronic level. Now, Gazans who are now 8 months into this madness are being exposed to things that I honestly don't understand. I don't know. And unless we can go tomorrow and actually put in devices and apparatuses to sort of measure the air, but we'll still have 8 months of data that we lost. Now, what I'm also concerned about is not just the environmental effects, but I'm actually talking about it from the region. Particulate matter, which is matter that is in particles that you end up inhaling, they become suspended in the air, and they also interact with other chemicals. They can reach, depending on their sizes, they are deposited in different parts of your airways, with the smallest particulate matter being PM 2.5. being lodged in your alveoli. So like it's very dangerous. However, what we know is that particulate matter doesn't respect boundaries. It doesn't respect borders. And so even from just a plain human level, I mean, I don't know if who's being exposed to this. I would imagine also Israelis. I would imagine people in the surrounding regions. I would imagine now again, this is speculative because we don't have access. We can't even bring in anything to measure it. That's one thing. I'm also duly concerned about the eons of stress that this has caused people and the modulation of your immune system that comes with that. What we've seen is that uh, like very extreme condition, and then not even not extreme conditions. So the environment can interact with your DNA, changing your ability to express certain genes. Now, what I am concerned, and these are called epigenetic modifications. And so if we look at stress markers and their downstream effects, we don't know what the long-term effects of these consequences are. We really don't. And another thing that like we can model these after previous horrible situations that people have seen. So in the middle of the 19th century, we had the Irish potato famine. And Gaza is right now experiencing famine on top of being in an immense stressful situation, and people are just trying to survive, and people are just trying to breathe, breathe and live. But on top of that, they're experiencing famine, and that's actually something we're overlooking in terms of long-term effect. Yes, it causes immediate starvation and death, and if not exacerbation of diseases, to weaken immune system, a whole slew of other horrible things. But what if these changes are inheritable? What happens then? What happens to the generational effects? What happens to the fact that even in Iraq, we can look at we had an increase in cancer rates of 200%. This is in immediate aftermath of the 91 invasion and until 2003. So what I can do that is my ability as a scientist is maybe just speculate. And this is in large part because we're not able to go to Gaza right now and actually sample the air and sample the soil and sample the water. But what I would imagine is that there's so much heavy metal contamination in the soil that it would probably be rather dangerous to grow anything. And the water situation, on top of just dehydration and thirst, and on top of compounding the famine that people are experiencing, I would imagine that even the water is contaminated from just the sheer amount of bombings. What I also worry about is the concrete material that is being pulverized over and over and over again. And this is also, you're now talking about aerosol science and the physics of it. And frankly, the physics of particulate matter in the context of incessant bombing is likely very different than just sort of normal particles being emitted by a factory. Because what's happening, and this is again what I would imagine is happening, it was with every bomb that's being dropped that you're seeing this redistribution of particulate matter that are sort of being re-emitted back into the air on top of the chemicals that are immediately being emitted by the bombs. Now, I am very interested in sort of not just the physics of this and the long-term effects of this, but we need data. We need a ceasefire immediately, and we need data. And the only 9/11 was horrible, but the only, I'm not saying the good thing, but there is one silver lining, and it was that scientists were immediately able in the aftermath of 9/11, because it was a single event, to go and send graduate students and collect a lot of the World Trade Center dust. And so they were able to analyze it and see exactly what people are being exposed to. And then they can sort of build these sort of animal models and all sorts of other models to see what are the effects of these. Now, what's happening right now in Gaza is a devastating set of not just ecological damage that I know Dr. Mazin will speak to, but it is I genuinely worry about the generational effects and the profound health effects that this is going to have in coming, in children, and the cancer rates and the teratogenicity potential of some of these chemicals that that pregnant women are being exposed to. And on top of that, I also, there was a fair amount of women who were pregnant in the early days of the war. I can't even speak to the levels of fetal maternal stress that is also causing a lot of these women, which is actually fairly well characterized. And the effects in the fetus have been seen just from these immense amounts of stress. I don't I don't know that I can fully capture. I think as an Iraqi person who was very fortunate, my immediate family members were affected by the war. We had cancer rates spike in our family alone. I think that this is just a matter of time that we're going to see a lot of these diseases. And I can only speculate because we don't have the capacity right now, unfortunately.
Meena, thank you so much for sharing that information and explaining the overlapping crises that Gaza is facing right now. And again, like you said, not only Gaza, but these the impacts of these weapons that will likely travel to the region and also have impacts on the climate, which will inevitably impact all of us. And again, particularly Gaza, which is one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. The point you made too about the cumulative effects of the bombings is also really horrific and interesting too when we think about the laws of war and proportionality in regards to the use of these weapons, and the fact that cumulative effects are typically not considered when we think about military proportionality, and that's a huge oversight. So thank you so much for sharing. I'd love to turn it over to you, Mazin, to talk with us. You have unbelievable expertise in regards to ecology and in Gaza, in occupied territories. If you'd love to share your thoughts here, as well as how this kind of harm, this isn't the first. Gaza has been attacked many times. And so kind of how this cumulative effect through history has been impacting people there and impacting the resistance to ongoing occupation.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much for hosting this and for doing this wonderful presentations by co-panelists. Meena covered a lot of grounds that I also thought I'd cover. So I'll switch a little bit and put the zoom out if you want. Picture of what's happening in colonialism in general is environmentally devastating around the world. I'm actually speaking to you from the continent right under Australia and New Zealand, where there was a lot of damage done by colonialism on the environment. There was colonialism in North America, for example, and its impact on the environment. So colonialism has always devastated the local environment and disrupted the connectivity of people to the land and the balance that occurs after thousands of years of co-evolution of people with the environment. So indigenous people normally live in relative harmony with their nature, with their environment, and colonialists come to reshape both the landscape and the people, expelling people or killing them, but also destroying the environment. And we saw this in our case of colonialism, the situation of Zionist colonization of Palestine, for example, diversion of water of the Jordan River Basin, which dropped from 1,350 million cubic meters per year to only 20 million cubic meters per year, basically has become a stream. This devastated the environment around the Jordan River Basin for both the people and for nature. And the same thing happened with the drying up of the wetlands in the north, Hula wetland. 12 Palestinian communities were removed and people were made homeless, but also 219 species of animals disappeared. I could give hundreds of similar examples. These are not immediately associated with a war or a conflict. They're natural and sorry to use this term, but they are a component of colonialism. Colonialism does this. So we can divide impact on the environment into three categories, if you want, of colonialism. One is the pre-conflict impact on the environment, and the one during the conflict, which Meena and Rasha covered, and one after the conflict, basically. So I want to just talk briefly about the pre-conflict impact on the environment. The colonizers in Palestine, by squeezing 2.3 million people in Gaza, 70% of them refugees, that's already a large concentration camp, not a very healthy environment. Even if it was open, even if there was a free exchange of goods and services, which was not, of course. Gaza was subjected to blockade and siege and restriction on electricity and so forth, even before this conflict. So pre-conflict, you have even sewage treatment was not possible, of course, because there was little fuel to operate sewage treatment facilities. So sewage was being dumped into the Mediterranean Sea. Fishing was limited to about 3 to 6 nautical miles, which basically reduced the fish populations in those areas. No fishing was allowed beyond that because of the gas fields off of Gaza that Israel wanted to exploit. So when you think about the impact on the Mediterranean coastal areas, again, pre-conflict, I'm talking about, without the 5 or 6 attacks on Gaza that happened before this one. So, and I could give many other examples of how Israeli policies have resulted in this destruction of the environment of Gaza. The denial of water to Gaza, for example, happened long before this particular conflict. Israel had blocked the normal passageway of water and the replenishment of the water aquifer and coastal water aquifer, which, due to both the decrease in recharge of the water aquifer and also due to the increased population in the Gaza Strip due to the ethnic cleansing from 1948 and beyond, this has resulted in overexploitation of what limited and decreasing aquifer. So the aquifer was already devastated even before this conflict. And when this conflict came, and you heard, for example, that Israeli forces have flooded the Gaza tunnels that are used by the resistance, similar to the Viet Cong tunnels, resisting the Americans in Vietnam. They flooded these tunnels with seawater, which goes under, of course, and finishes off the aquifer. That's an activity during conflict. And this is another thing that one should say is that these things are overlap, and there's a multiplicative and exaggerating effects of all things. For example, if I take climate change, this was mentioned earlier, Israel producing greenhouse gases by its military activities. That overlaps with climate change ramifications, etc., not just immediate it impacts the whole globe, actually. The Israeli military and the American military produce a lot of greenhouse gases. All conflicts produce greenhouse gases. And in terms of the conflict itself, if we pursue this and talk about it, the conflict produces all sorts of effects on the environment, which were discussed. And Jesse, can you lower that, please? And the conflict devastated the environment. Over 90% of the plant cover in Gaza is gone. That includes both wild plants and also the agricultural fields in Gaza, which are intentionally plowed. That basically the carbon footprint of this, if you want, a destruction of those carbon stores and the ability to do this is devastated. One could go on a lot, but as Meena also pointed out, we need a lot of research, which we don't have the ability to do now. We can do like remote sensing for the plant cover. We can do some things remotely, but without sampling on the ground, photography on the ground, it's very hard to do. And now, with the destruction of all the universities and research centers in Gaza, this is even more difficult. So how to proceed along these kinds of studies would be difficult for us to foresee now. Hopefully, this will become clearer in the next few weeks. And when I go to post-conflict effects, this we see in the West Bank, for example, with a lot of increase in cancer rates, etc., increase in birth defects, especially around the areas where a lot of the fortified tear gas is being used, a different kind of tear gas, etc. We see infertility increasing in some areas due to the military industries and military training grounds, etc. This is both pre-conflict, during conflict, and after conflict effects. The industrial settlements, which most of them are, of course, colonial activities, etc. This is all. And then in Gaza, the unexploded munitions, the white phosphorus that leaves the residues, all of this stuff, in post-conflict scenario is devastating to the environment. I'll stop here, and again, I re-emphasize what the other panelists have said. We need a lot of work on this area. We need a lot of research. I'm happy to collaborate with others who are interested to do research on these areas as we can. There are some areas we can do, some things we will just have to wait and see if there are some people collecting soil samples, etc., in Gaza, but we have to be able to smuggle them outside if it's possible, but we'll see what happens. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Oh, we might have lost Rasha. Thank you so much for that and for that very important overview of the this conflict in the context of ongoing siege. I would like to ask also to Meena and to Dr. Qumsiyeh if you have some thoughts. The Biden administration recently released, in partnership with Israel, a three-part plan for the day after in Gaza. And so we talked about it a little bit, but wondering your thoughts on what should be considered as part of this plan for reconstruction, and your thoughts on climate and environmental justice in that context as well. Meena, if you'd like. Dr.
Do you want, Dr. Mazin, do you want to take it, or, I mean, I can always add on, or do you want me to try?
Go ahead, please.
Okay, Hanna, forgive me, I was typing something. So you're asking about the immediate plan of what an ideal immediate plan from the Biden administration should be in terms of reconstruction of Gaza. Okay, so there were some really wonderful questions that I was working on. First of all, the immediate action has to stop. That's all that, I mean, that is a fundamental, very, very basic and fundamental. So that's number one. Number two, reconstruction, I mean, you have to, so you're talking about bioremediation. remediation of the soil, and that you can do that several ways. And there was a really wonderful question on how long it would take for really the soil to come back. The problem is we have to assess what's in it. And the second thing you have to do, the half-life of some of these toxic compounds can be thousands of years. There were mentions of some reports. This was back 10 years ago, and there was it was completed by a group of scientists in 2014, and it was also sort of assessing the smaller attacks by Israel on Gaza, and this was in 2014 and prior offenses. Now, what they saw in the soil is also the presence of depleted uranium, which we did see in Iraq. Now depleted uranium has like a fairly significant half-life unless the ground soil is remediated from it. It's just going to linger, and it has, even though the health effects have yet to be determined on depleted uranium, it is still a very radioactive compound. So that's number one. We also have heavy metals. The heavy metals that we see are carcinogenic. Well, I mean, heavy metals include arsenic, cadmium, chromium, especially hexavalent chromium. These things aren't just going to go away. You have to have efforts in terms of soil remediation. This takes a lot of money, a lot of funding, and a lot of technologies to try and even clean it. The thing that we see is that even in the United States, we see Superfund sites, and these are places where pollution has just, they've been designated by the EPA as regions in which pollution has been there for quite a while and has been sort of designated. These places become very, very difficult, if not impossible, to really, really clean. That's number one. Number two, we have to sort of we need technologies to go into Gaza right now and to assess the actual pollution. That's what we need to start with, as well. And then I will also let Dr. Mazin continue as well.
If I may just say something about plan after. A lot of what happened in Gaza can be repaired, but a lot of it cannot be repaired and cannot be reclaimed. And certainly a lot of the environmental damage cannot be repaired or reclaimed. So we really have to understand the colonial mentality is to plan for the natives and do things without even consulting with the natives or indigenous people. In the case of Israel, this has been long-term policy of colonialism to basically plan things for colonial interests without taking care of the interests of the environment, like when they destroyed millions and millions of trees and planted only pine trees to replace them. The other thing that Israel has done is designate so-called nature reserves, which are designated not by biologists or environmentalists, but by the Jewish National Fund for political purposes, to develop the military industries, to develop military training zone in most of the country. Israel is a militarized country that's not concerned at all about the environment and is one of the worst countries in the world in terms of environmental record, if you want. Yet they dub themselves, by public relations and Hasbara as a green country, but it was completely damaging to our environment. And now the use of burning and they talked about burning 1,000 acres in the Galilee by rockets from Hezbollah. Actually, 10 times more land was burned in South Lebanon by white phosphorus, etc., in terms of forests, etc. Israel has been devastating the environment, not just of Palestine, historical Palestine, but also of nearby countries, and will continue to do that with the support, aiding and abetting of the US. So any plans the US and Israel come up with, you have to take them in the context of continued colonization, continued destruction, and continued, business as usual, as we say. So business as usual is not sustainable for any human being in our land, and it will be destructive.
That's Rasha. I'm wondering too if you have thoughts in your experience doing humanitarian work in conflict and post-conflict situations on what are best practices for the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip, and as we've just heard as well, ensuring that we don't recreate systems of colonialism in that process. And I was wondering if you have had thoughts on that, given your previous experience and knowledge of reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan and other places, for example. Oh, we might have lost her. She's so wonderful for joining from Egypt. I don't know
I
if
may just
yeah.
also say I have to leave in about 3 minutes because I have another call, another talk I have to give. So I apologize, but I'm sure Meena and Rasha can take any questions, and you, Hanna, also.
No, thank you so much for joining us, especially for being in New Zealand and making this time and effort, and for all of your work that you've been doing. We're so grateful for you, and so grateful you were able to join us today. We have some wonderful questions too in the chat. I just want to acknowledge those. We won't be able to get to all of those, but I am noting them down, and we can hopefully have some conversations among the panel and try and get back to folks because there's some really thoughtful and wonderful questions here. So thank you.
There he is.
Yeah. One other point I just wanted to mention too is that these weapons are causing this harm, the direct harm, as we've mentioned, the destruction of all of the infrastructure, the death and destruction that we're seeing in Gaza. It's causing long-term pollution and contamination. It's part of the ongoing process of genocide and ethnic cleansing. And these weapons also, though, we should remember, also do have impacts in the United States. Meena, as you had mentioned, right now there are currently 40,000 military sites across the United States and territories that are contaminated with toxic military waste and legacy explosive due to the domestic production and testing of these weapons before we send them abroad to partners, for example, to Israel. This has already cost $40 billion attempting to clean them up, has created cascading public health challenges that we really are barely, again, also not understanding, because the scientific testing on the impact of domestic exposure to these chemicals is also very lacking, and historically has a disproportionate impact on low-income and marginalized populations. We know that folks that live near Superfund sites, the ones that you had mentioned, Meena, living near Superfund site is correlated with lower life expectancy in the lower communities, and these Superfund sites are often put in communities that are of lower income. So just want to also connect that back to, this is a moral issue. We need a ceasefire immediately to halt this genocide, but the contamination and the harmful ecological and environmental effects that will have and do have direct impacts on human health, well-being, and peace and security also extend to people in the United States. And so it's all in all of our interests to really come together in this, come together for our collective security and in collective struggle for liberation for all. So I just kind of wanted to mention that here. We have a few minutes left, and we have some fantastic questions. I don't know if Rasha, if you're here, sorry, if you wanted to talk a little.
I am.
And thank you for
I was lucky my connection lasted this long. So I'm on my cell phone right now. So I hope you could all hear me. I don't care if you could see me. It's okay. I look like a hot mess. But I hope you could all hear me. Actually, I just wanted, if you don't mind, if I could just plug in a couple of points, because I think I might have missed something at some point. Hanna, you had mentioned in the beginning that the US and in fact Israel are not signatories to certain conventions or parties. And actually, when it comes to IHL, rules of war, and other conventions, you don't actually have to be a signatory. So again, the Convention Against Genocide, the Convention Against Apartheid, IHL in general, these are applicable to state and non-state actors as well. So again, because really the idea of being a signatory on something like this is just to show that you agree with the message. So even they don't want you, it's not applicable to only signatories, because again, that would be a problem. And the whole point is that they have some type of legal standing to be able to take to some type of judicial approach at some point. So you could see it with tribunals, or you could see it now with the ICC and the ICJ. So again, they don't actually have to be signatories, but it is interesting to see when they are not and why their reasoning is for that. And again, you touched on the principle of proportionality, and with that goes the principle of military necessity and unnecessary suffering, pretty much the four main principles of IHL. And we could see, again, they've been disregarded over and over, not just since October when it comes specifically to Israel. This has been going on in different ways for the past 75 years with Israel, and you have numerous crimes against humanity and war crimes that have actually been broken. And when it comes to, someone had asked the question about how long do you think it will take Gaza to heal from this environmentally and I'm sure by extension psychologically. And I'm sure the doctors here, I'm not a professional here, but I am assuming just from past, like they said, conflicts and wars and studies that have been done, this can take just generations and decades for the soil to rehabilitate from what's happening with the weapons. And remember, we're seeing new types of weaponry being used on a very small, concentrated area that's just 26 miles long, at its widest almost 6 miles wide. And really, Gaza, unfortunately, is going to be it's going to set a precedent, and it's going to be a case study for generations to come. This is an unfortunate reality that we're seeing now. And Dr. Aladdin, you had mentioned that mothers who are breastfeeding, actually, we just visited a hospital here a couple of days ago, and we're going to go to different hospitals to visit Palestinian refugees who had been approved to cross from Gaza into Egypt to get medical treatments. And a lot of them have had buildings collapse on them. And a lot of these are children. The youngest one I met was a 7-month-old who had a building collapse on him, and they were able to pull him out of the rubble and receive treatment. And one of them is a mother who's breastfeeding, and she was telling me how her husband her baby was born during the war. That's all she knows. During a genocide, really. I hate using the word war here. And she had said how her husband was afraid of the impact of the stress hormones that would translate to her breast milk and then go towards her baby. And he was really afraid, to the point where he said, don't breastfeed her anymore. The problem was there was no other alternative. But he was so worried about the hormonal changes and the psychological impact that she was transferring to her child that he did not want her to breastfeed her child anymore. And of course, the child is very malnourished and underweight. So, we're seeing that just already from the people that we're talking to. So again, the long-term impacts, 30, 40, 50, 60 years from now, like both of the doctors said, is really worrying to see what's going to happen then.
Thank you so
And again, sorry, we tended to we always tie it back to the civilian population, but again, we're talking about flora, fauna, what kind of the impact that it's going to have actually on the physical environment itself.
Completely. It is the hour, so we will have to end there, but I really wanted to thank all of the panelists so much for being here and sharing. We could have a lot longer conversation about this, and also hoping that this will kind of be the beginning of more conversations on the ecological and environmental impacts of war. So please do, everyone who's tuned in, stay tuned. We will like to get this recording to folks and also try and get as many answers to these questions to you as well. Really appreciate everybody's time today. I don't know, Meena and Rasha, if you had one thing you wanted to close out with. We are over time, so no problem, but if you wanted to say anything, you're welcome to.
Yeah, I think, with military aggression, be it by the United States, by Israel, we tend to see that the effects on civilians isn't even considered. And this is why these things are so understudied. And I want to drive that clear. So in Iraq, what we saw were these massive burn pits. These are just ongoing pits of fire that people just throw everything in there and that cause so much damage to the atmosphere and to the environment. And actually, the only way we know about their health effects is through American soldiers who came. We do not care, and there's very limited data on the burn pits and the effects on Iraqi civilians. And I think this is very telling of where we are, and not even just the state of the science, but also like it's very intentional. I mean, I can't separate it as such. I mean, I think it comes part of this dehumanization where civilian lives are sort of relegated to it's just matter of fact, as we're less than, as Iraqis and Palestinians and a lot of people of color are just relegated, and this is just sort of you're just in the way of the bomb. The bomb will be there. And I think that this is sort of the mentality that intense militarism really is centered around. And I will say that there are so many wonderful questions. I know I don't know if there's a way we can answer them and send them to the answer them anonymously, of course, but if we can do that, Hannah.
I think so. Yes, they're noted down, and we would love. We have everyone's email address registered today, so we can probably share those as well, just with everyone, maybe as a follow-up, like paper response, and have this be kind of a topic of ongoing discussion and education as well. The more that we can all learn from each other on this and share with others, this is the work that we need to do as we're seeing our government continually fail to take the steps needed to uphold basic human rights, but also to ensure that we all have a livable future. So with that, we'll have to end, but truly, truly appreciate both of you, your invaluable contribution and your work. Thank you so much, and we'll definitely be in touch. And thank you to everyone who joined. Expect to hear from us, and please do keep in touch. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank
you,
you all.
Rasha.
Thank
Bye, guys.
you. Bye.